Salve or salvete. Today's video is going to cover the perfect active system. So what is the perfect active system? The perfect active system, and really the perfect system in general, is comprised of three tenses: the perfect tense, pluperfect tense, and future perfect tense. Take all those three tenses, put them up together, they together make the perfect system. To form the perfect active system, all you have to do, no matter the conjugation, to create any of those tenses, to create any of those forms, you have to drop the long I out of the third principal part, and then just add the correct ending based off of the tense, number, and person, because as we learned in the present active system, we can use the ending of the verb to manipulate the end of the verb to change tense, person, number, and, as we will learn later, mood of the verb. Now, as we learned with the present active system, it was very confusing. There was a lot of rules that we had to follow, like third IO, it kept an I all the way through. There was some weird stuff that we had to do with U's for third IO, and fourth, and then it just got all kind of weird, different letters that you had to remember. With the perfect active system, it is super, super easy to form. Like I say there, it's as simple as dropping that long I out of the third principal part, and then just adding the forms that I will teach later. It's very simple. It's very intuitive. Now, I say the third principal part. It's entirely possible that being very early in your Latin careers, you don't know what principal parts are, and that's not a problem. I'm going to introduce the concept of principal parts because they're fundamental. If you don't understand principal parts, then the rest of my video is not going to make any sense. So I will have that introduction. If you already know what principal parts are, I will link to the description, the point at which I think that you can skip over all that. But then I do talk about how the third principal part changes based off of the conjugation of the verb, and I do think that that's important for everybody to watch. So I will link to the point to where I get to that point of the video. Here's my introduction to principal parts. What are principal parts? If you were to look at a Latin dictionary, for most verbs, you will see 4 forms, then you will see the definition. Those 4 forms are what's known as the principal parts of a verb. The principal parts are essential to be known because they can tell us a number of characteristics about the verb itself. It tells us the conjugation of the verb. It can tell us whether or not the verb is defective. It can tell us how the verb is conjugated, and they are very important to know because of that last part, how it's conjugated. The third principal parts is essential for knowing how you conjugate the perfect active system into Latin. For the most part, Latin verbs have 4 principal parts. There are tons and tons of exceptions to this. There are verbs with 3 principal parts, there are verbs with only 2 principal parts. Every Latin verb will have at least 1 principal part. I can guarantee you that because there has to be then it wouldn't be a verb. It wouldn't exist if it had no principal parts. The first principal part of the verb is the first person singular present active indicative, and this is used to form the present active system. If we remember from the present active system video, we use this form a lot, and we tacked things onto it, and it was very useful to forming that system. If we had a verb like amo, if I looked at amo in a dictionary, it would be amo, amare, amavi, amatus, meaning to love. Amo is its first principal part. The first principal part, in conjunction with the second principal part, can help you determine the conjugation of the verb. I say in conjunction because there are some clues in the first principal part that can tell you the conjugation of the verb, but the second principal part tells you definitely what the conjugation is, but you can use both of those together. The first and the second principal part are also really useful for creating forms in the present active system. The second principal part is the present active infinitive. If we go to our friend amo again, that it would be amare, would be the second principal part. Amare meaning, again, to love. Now we get into the third principal part. As I have said, you need to know this. This is why it is starred. This is the first person singular perfect active indicative of the verb. The way that the perfect system works, all you have to do is remove the ending, which I will teach you later, and then you can add endings. You can just add endings to the stem from the ending that you just removed. And that's how you form the perfect system, and it is really, really simple to form. And don't worry, I will have plenty of examples later, and it will make sense. Finally, the fourth principal part, it's called the perfect passive participle. Right now, you don't need to know what participles are. You just need to know that this exists, because a lot of times it's not the perfect passive participle. It can sometimes be the supine, it can sometimes be the future active participle. But right now, as Latin 1 students, you just need to know that that form is there, memorize it, internalize it. You don't know how to use it, or you don't need to know how to use it yet. As I've said, when you're working in the perfect active system, you use the third principal part, and then you add your endings to that. I cannot stress this enough that you need to know the third principal parts of verbs for the perfect system to make sense. You need to memorize them. It is literally impossible for you to form verbs in the perfect system if you do not know this part. All right, everyone should be back together again, or we should all be back. This is the point in the video where if you skip my introduction, this is where you come back to. So, salve or salvete again. Now I'm going to go over some of the patterns that verbs follow when forming the third and fourth principal parts. If you just heard my introduction, you heard me say something to the effect of, you cannot form verbs in the perfect active system if you do not know the third principal parts. While that sentence in itself is true, you can guess the third and fourth principal parts of verbs if you know the conjugation of the verb, because there are some patterns that are followed when forming those principal parts. I think the best example of that is first conjugation. So let's get into this to see what I'm talking about. First conjugation verbs, if we remember, this is the verbs with the RA infinitive ending. When forming the third and fourth principal parts, this sticks pretty regularly to a pattern. So O-R-A, because we have to have our infinitive ending. Then it goes awi, and then atus for the third and the fourth principal parts. A lot of first conjugation verbs do this. As you see there, I have 3 examples. There are many more that I could have picked from, but there are these 3 examples. And as you see in blue, those are the endings, those are the endings that are tacked on because those are the patterns that first conjugation verbs follow. So amo, amare, amawi, amatus, meaning to love. Notice there it goes awi, atus for its third and fourth principal parts. Paro does the same thing. Paro, parare, parawi, paratus, to prepare. Laboro does the same thing. Laboro, laborare, laboravi, laboratus, to work. So if you know it's a first conjugation verb, and you're a little bit stuck, and you don't know exactly, what it is, a good bet is getting rid of that infinitive ending, and then just adding awi, and just say that would be your third principal part, and then from there you can drop the long I and then just tack the endings, which I'll teach later. Now this is a good thing to point out. Notice how all 3 third principal parts end with a long I. The first person singular perfect ending is a long I. That's why all third principal parts, assuming the verb is not defective, will have the same ending. That's why I say remove that ending first before you tack on the correct endings based on the tense, number, and person of the verb. So that's why I say remove the long I, because that's an ending. That's not what you want to that's not what you want to attach your endings to. You want to attach your endings to the third principal part once the long I has been removed. So with amo, you want to attach it to the amav, not the amawi. Now let's move into the second conjugation patterns. These are the ones with the are infinitive ending, the long E-R-E. This is one of the first ones where we see multiple tracks that it will fall down. So normally it will either follow down O, A, Ui, or O, A, Si. Both of those for the third principal parts. Now, it can either go itus, tus, or sus in the fourth principal part. That's not nearly as important to know. So here are 3 examples of that. So moneo. Notice that says moneo, not maneo. Those are 2 very simple verbs to mix up. So moneo, monere, monui, monitus. That means to warn. Notice that it follows that ui pattern. Dokeo, dokere, dokui, doctus, to teach. That's another one that follows the ui pattern. Habeo will also follow this ui pattern. Habeo, habere, habui, habitus, to have or hold. And then maneo is an example of one of the si patterns. Maneo, manere, mansi, mansus, meaning to stay. Now I would like to point out, like with both first conjugation, second conjugation, and all the conjugations I will talk about, they all have exceptions to the rule. So this is not a 100%, this is definitely going to happen rule to go off of. These are more like guidelines. If you're stuck, this is a good place to start when forming these if you're stuck on tests or something like that. But there are always exceptions. With first conjugation, it's easier to just memorize the exceptions than to be wary about them because that's actually pretty stable. With second conjugation, you do want to be a little bit more aware because those do get a little bit funky sometimes. So now let's get into third and third IO. These have the ure infinitive ending, the short E R E. The pattern that they follow is psych. They do not follow a pattern. Third conjugation and third IO are as you will find, just whack to work with. That's the best way I can describe it. So there are a couple of different patterns that they will follow. I've just listed the most important ones that I think that you should know. Third conjugation, you're just going to have to memorize these. Latin, especially Latin 1 and Latin 2, it's a lot of memorizing. So the more you memorize third conjugation, the third principal part of third conjugation verbs, the easier it will be the higher up in Latin that you go. I'm sorry, it wasn't fun when I memorized it, and it's not a whole lot of fun. But that's just how it goes sometimes. Here are some patterns that third conjugation verbs will follow. While they are scattered all over the place, there are just so many different patterns. They're just not a good one to just solely memorize and go off of. But I will explain some of the patterns that do appear, because I think that those are cool and interesting to see. So one of the patterns is that it will go X long I in the third principal part. 2 verbs that do this, duco, ducere, duxi, ductus, to lead, and coquo, coquere, coxi, coctus, to cook. Another pattern that verbs will follow is that the first vowel of a verb will go long. So if it's originally short, it will go long in the third principal part. And then another thing to note, if the first vowel is an A, that will normally change to a long E. So facio, facere, faci, factus. Notice how that first vowel goes long, and since it's an A, it shifts to an E. That means to make or to do. Emo, emere, ami, emptus, to buy. And yakio, yakere, yaki, yaktus, to throw. Now, a very important thing, especially with emo, we will learn later that the third person singular perfect ending is an IT. So the third person singular present active indicative and the third person singular perfect active indicative forms, they'll be ambiguous with one exception. that first E will be long. And with the long first vowels, especially if it's a short verb, or really, if it's a long first vowel and it's not something obvious like that A shifts to an E, you gotta be really, really careful, and that's a really easy mistake to make. Like Fugio, that's another one that has a long first vowel. It goes Fugio, Fugere, Fugi with a long U. And the only difference between he flees and he fled is a long U. So you got to pay very, very close attention when you're dealing with a verb that has a long first vowel. Another pattern that that third conjugation verbs will go down is that its third principal part will reduplicate. I like to think of this as a broken record. Like you will repeat the same syllable twice. A verb that exemplifies this that I did not put up here is the verb posco. It's posco, poskere, papaski. So that third principal part, papaski, you're essentially saying that first syllable twice. And that's really what the reduplicative third principal parts do. It's just repeating that first syllable twice. And that's one thing to keep in mind when you're reading Latin is if you see that first syllable twice, think to yourself, hey, I might be working in the perfect here. So 3 verbs that are reduplicative in addition to posco: curo, curre, cucuri, cursurus, meaning to run, Kaido, Kaidere, Kikiri, Kaisus, to cut, and Pello, Pellere, Pepuli, Pulsus, to drive. Notice that really you're repeating the first consonant twice, and it's a little awkward, but at least if you see that, you'll know that you'll be working in the perfect. If you're questioning yourself why Chrysurus looks a little bit different than Kaisus and Pulsus, with the extra UR, don't worry about that. It's because cursus technically does not exist, so they just throw in different participles for the fourth principal part if the perfect passive participle does not exist. So just like I said, just memorize that. That won't be important until you get to Latin 2. Another category that third conjugation verbs follow is that they follow second conjugation perfect rules, which I think is cool, or which I think is, I don't know, cool, interesting. It's what the Latin gods decided to do, so we just have to go with it and memorize it. So there will be third conjugation verbs that will have that ui, will have that c. They'll even have a vi sometimes in that third principal part. I only put the SIs up there because most of the verbs that you have to be mindful of now follow that SI rule, namely scribo and mitto. So scribo, scribere, scripsi, scriptus, to write. There's also lido, lidere, lysi, lysis, to hurt or harm. And then there's mitto, mittere, misi, misus, to send. If you want examples of verbs that go ui, akuo, akure, akui, meaning to sharpen, that will go ui. And then kerno, kernere, krewi, meaning to discern. That's an example of a vi verb. Or third principal part. But anyways, now let's move into the fourth conjugation where a little bit of normalcy will return, I promise. These are the verbs that have the ire infinitive ending, the long I-R-E. Normally, the pattern that they will follow is o, ire, iwi, itus. So, audio, audire, audivi, auditus, to hear. Dormio does the same thing, so dormio, dormire, dormivi, meaning to sleep. That will have that iwi, third principal part, my bad. Another track that it could go down is the UI, is a UI track. So aperio, aperire, aperui, apertus, meaning to open. And then salio, salire, salui, saltus, meaning to leap. Both of those, that'll go UI. So with fourth conjugation, there's a little bit of that second conjugation influence in there. but mostly think that long I, vi, that's what you will see most of the time. Now, as this idea of different endings being indicative of working in the perfect system is starting to permeate, I want to go back through these endings and just talk about them a little bit more and what you should do if you recognize them when you're reading Latin. So the first conjugation, if we remember, these are the awi endings. This is the most common third principal part for first conjugation. So if you have a verb that you don't know, and you know its first conjugation, you don't know what its third principal part is, throwing awi in, not a bad guess by any stretch of the imagination. Some identifiers that give it away for second conjugation perfect is the u to the long I and then s to the long I. Some third conjugation identifiers, or if it goes x long I, s long I, u long I, v long I, then if the first vowel goes long, or that a changes to a long e, or if the third principal part reduplicates, or if you see something that has the same consonant repeated twice. The fourth conjugation, the other conjugation, they follow the iwi and ui track. So if you see that long I, vi, or that ui, you know you're probably working with the perfect. Now that I have this lifted up, I want you to take a look at it and just keep these consonants and u and other categories like long vowel and reduplicative in mind. If you're working with Latin and you see a verb and you see a form that you don't recognize, but you see that v plus an ending that I'm going to teach later, or you see that u plus an ending I'm going to teach later, if you see the verb reduplicate, if you see it do any of these things plus one of the perfect stems, you got to think to yourself, hey, we might be working in the perfect system here. It's also good to see these things to sort of get used to looking at different endings to verbs. Because I'll admit, if you look at a perfect verb, it looks a lot different and it looks weird and awkward and not something you're used to. At least when we worked with the present system, everything sort of looked like the first principal part, or at least the beginning after we've tacked on the ending, or the beginning before we tacked on the ending. In the perfect system, we are making substantial changes to verbs. We're physically changing the makeup, like with long vowel. We're physically changing letters. We're adding letters. We're drastically changing how they look. So it is very, very important that you get used to looking at these consonants, looking at these different categories, so you know, hey, when you see this, you know that this is something in the perfect, and you're ready for it when you see it in Latin. And when you translate and you think to yourself, maybe this isn't correct because this looks too weird, trust yourself that you know, yes, this is definitely in the perfect system. Although this looks a little weird, I know this works because I know that this is how this verb translates into the perfect system. I know that this conjugation follows these patterns, and that's how, and I know that that works because of the patterns. And these patterns are good because they take a little less memorizing, with the exception of third conjugation. Unfortunately, third conjugation, there's really nothing you can do around that. But this makes it a little bit easier for you to comprehend the perfect system. And with that, my discussion of principal parts and all of that is done, and we can finally get into learning the endings and the different verb endings for the different tenses in the perfect system. Now let us begin the discussion of the perfect tense. The perfect tense is used to denote an action that happened or did happen in the past. That kind of gives away how you translate the perfect tense. Just a little bit of a discussion of the perfect tense itself. The word perfect, it comes from the Latin participle perfectus, which means completed or having been completed. That makes it very fitting for what the perfect tense is used for. So it's used for actions that are completed in the past. So when you think perfect tense, think completed. It's done, it happened, we don't have to worry about it anymore. So going back to our favorite sentence, Marcus Pilum ad sextum jacet. Marcus threw the ball to Sextus. And I just want to highlight jacet real quick. We know that this comes from jaccio, or if you don't know, this comes from the verb jaccio, meaning to throw. Jaccio is one of those verbs that it goes long first vowel in its third principal part. As you see there, jacet looks substantially different from jaccio. So that's why it's really important to sort of get familiar with those categories, so you're not surprised if you see one of those verbs that fall into one of those categories pop up when you're reading Latin. But anyways, Marcus Pilum ad sextum jacet. Marcus threw the ball to Sextus. That's how you would translate it. There are a couple other ways to translate the perfect tense. You can translate it as verbed, as I did, has or have verbed, depending on the subject-verb agreement, and did verb. Those are all acceptable ways of translating it. I stick with verb. That's just personally how I do it. But this sentence, you'd have no problem translating it as Marcus has thrown the ball to Sextus, or Marcus did throw the ball to Sextus. So now let's look at these perfect endings. These are the perfect endings that you tack on to the third principal parts of verbs after you remove that long I. And as you see there, the long I, that's the first person singular ending. That's why we have to remove it, because that's an ending. We want to remove that ending so we can add the other endings onto it. We just don't want to keep adding endings onto other endings, because then it gets weird and confusing and it just doesn't work. So that's why we remove that long I, because we're clearing the verb of all current endings that are on it, so we can add the ending that's correct for the person and number of the sentence. So these are the perfect endings. For first person singular subject, we have a long I. Second person singular subject, isti, ist, long I. Third person singular subject, it, it. First person plural subject, imus. Second person plural subject, istis, istis, and third person plural subject, erunt, long E, UR, and T. Notice how the T and the NT, they're still here. That's just some identifiers, is that you'll often see the T and the NT for third person singular and third person plural endings respectively all throughout Latin. As you see the IS in both as you see the tis in second person plural, you see the mus in first person. There's a lot of little patterns that still shine through even with different endings. I think that those are always cool, looking at the similarities between two different things. And as I've just had this discussion, and you're going to hear me say this so often, I'm just going to sound like a broken record. You take the endings that you need to use depending on the person and number of the sentence. You take that, you subtract the long I off the third principal part, then you add that ending in. And that's simple. And that's why the perfect system is so much easier than the present system, because you don't have to do any weird things. You don't have to remember weird U's for third IO, and fourth. You don't have to remember that third IO has an I all the way through. All you have to do, subtract one little form and add an ending to it. It's very easy. You don't have to remember all the little nitty-gritty rules. You just have to memorize third principal parts, which you'd have to do it anyway. So it's not that hard. So now let's take a look at some example sentences. Here's the first sentence. We loved the dog. That would be rendered into Latin as nos canem amavimus. To break down this verb, just to make sure that we all know how we got to this form, amavimus. This comes from amo, meaning to love, the third principal part. First conjugation verb, as we remember, so we have that awi ending. So amawi, that's the third principal part. Amawi, we subtract that long I, so we clear all of the endings, and now we have the form amav that we can add the ending on based on the correct number and person. So amav plus the first person plural ending. We, as a first person plural pronoun, which is how we got to that first person plural ending, which is imus, to get us to amawimus. Notice how the nos is in parentheses, because it's implied. As I've said, the ending of the verb and the subject will always agree. So you don't necessarily have to have the subject of the sentence. A lot of times in Latin, they just won't have a subject. It'll just be implied by the ending of the verb. So that's why you don't necessarily need the nos there. It would not be incorrect if you didn't include it. The next sentence that I have here is the girls have stayed in the country house. That would be rendered into Latin as puellae in villa manserunt. Manserunt, this comes from maneo, not moneo. This comes from maneo with an A. Its third principal part is mansi. Mansi, subtract that long I, just leaves you with mons. And then mons plus the third person plural perfect ending. Since the girls is, since it's a noun, since it's a plural noun, it's third person plural. So we have to add that errant ending. So mons plus errant gets us to monserunt. And I think I said this in the last video, if there is a definite subject, if a noun is a subject, you do have to include that. That can't just be implied by a verb. Only pronouns can be implied by verbs. So I, you, he, she, it, y'all, they. Those you don't have to include if they're the subject because they'll be implied by the verb. But if dog was the subject of the previous sentence, or the girls here, you do actually have to write in the noun as the sentence. But always make sure that the subject and the ending of the verb agree in person and number. Now let us get into the pluperfect tense. The pluperfect tense, also referred to as past perfect, is used to denote things that had happened. This is kind of a hint to how it's translated. It's translated as had verbed. So pluperfect had happened in the past. Unfortunately, this is the last time that you will see my Marcus throwing the ball to Sextus example sentence. Wanted to switch it up a little bit for future perfect. So Marcus pilum ad sextum iecerat. This would be translated as Marcus had thrown the ball to Sextus. Translating this into English, as I've said, the only acceptable translation is had verbed. Notice that this is had with a D. We saw with perfect that there is a has and a have translation, depending on the subject-verb agreement. Here in pluperfect, it's had. That's a very, very important distinction, one that I struggled with a little bit in Latin 1, but we're not going to get into that. But it's very important that you remember that pluperfect is translated as had verbed, and perfect is has/have verbed, did verb, and verbed. So just remember pluperfects had verbed. So now let's get into these verb endings. The verb endings, as you see them on the screen there, you might be thinking to yourself, hey, wait, I've seen this before. You're right, it is imperfect sum esse. And this is another thing that makes the perfect system just so much easier than the present system. You don't have to memorize 3 new sets of forms. You only have to memorize 1. But if you already have imperfect sum esse memorized, and then future sum esse translated for pluperfect or for future perfect, you're fine. Now, future perfect does have one exception, which I'll get into later. But right now, for pluperfect tense, it's just imperfect sum esse. So first person singular eram, second person singular eras, third person singular erat, first person plural erama, second person plural eratus, and third person plural is erant. If you have not learned the Sombrero song yet, eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant, and that's one way that you can remember it. That's how I've always remembered it. You'll see me and Kurtaman sometimes still doing that to make sure I have the right form. But anyways, as I have said, and like I said, I'm sorry, I'm going to be a broken record on this. You tack these endings onto the third principal part once you've subtracted that long I. Now, here it's imperative to get rid of that long I because there's no forms that that long I could be in pluperfect. You got to get rid of that long I before you tack on your endings. So take amo again. If I wanted the first person singular pluperfect of amo, it wouldn't be a mawiram. It would not be that. It would be a maweram. Now let's get into the example sentences for the pluperfect tense. Let's start with this first one. I had departed from Italy yesterday. This would be rendered into Latin as ab Italia heri discesseram. As I said before, just as a quick subject thing again, since I is a pronoun, you do not have to translate it into Latin. You know from the ending of the verb that this is first person singular. So if you have it, it's not wrong. If you don't have it, it's not wrong either. Both ways, ego ab Italia heri discesseram and ab Italia heri discesseram, both perfectly acceptable ways of translating it. To break down where this verb comes from, this comes from discedo. This is another third conjugation verb. It's a compound. Cedo is the root verb that this comes from. Unfortunately, this one doesn't follow a pattern either. You're just gonna, there's a couple of verbs that just have double consonants, then an I. That's another category you're just gonna have to memorize, unfortunately. But anyways, discedo, its third principal part is discessi. Discessi, subtract that long I, you're just left with discess. Discess plus your first person singular ending, because the subject is I, which is first person singular, which is eram, gets you discesseram. Now we move into the second sentence. You had annoyed Cornelia, very much so. Would be rendered into Latin as Cornelium valde vexaveras. Once again, you do not need that. You do not need the to translated into Latin. Just to break down where this comes from vexo. Its third principal part is vexavi. Vexavi, subtract that long I, is just left with vexav. Vexav plus the second person singular ending gets you to vexaveras, because the second person singular ending is eras. Just a note for me, yes, I do know that you can be ambiguous into second person singular and second person plural. I will say y'all if it's second person plural. That's just how I distinguish between singular and plural when I'm writing these sentences. So if you see y'all, it's plural. If you just see you, assume that it is singular. And this sentence, as you probably know, if you are a student of Ecce Romani, you probably know who the you is referring to, which is our favorite character, Sextus. Now let's move into the last tense that makes up the perfect system, the future perfect tense. The future perfect tense is used to denote actions that will be completed before another action. Because of this construction where you have two actions taking place, you'll most often see the future perfect tense in a subordinate clause with a future tense verb in the main clause. An example of this construction, future perfect verb subordinate clause, future verb main clause, is a little bit of a variation of our Marcus and Sextus throwing the ball sentence. In Latin, this sentence is cum Marcus et Sextus pillam jacerent, mater eos vocabit. This is translated into English as when Marcus and Sextus will have thrown the ball, the mother will call them. This sentence really does exemplify this construction. So Marcus and Sextus will be throwing the ball when their mother is calling them. That's an action that's being completed before the main action, the mother calling them, happens. That's why that's the definition of future perfect. It's used to denote actions that will be completed before another action happens, or in this case, the main action for this sentence. The two ways that you can translate the future perfect is you can translate it as will have verbed like I have done, but you can also translate it like it's a present tense verb. Another way of translating the above sentence is when Marcus and Sextus throw the ball, the mother will call them. Both will have verbed and just verbs are acceptable translations if you're working in this subordinate clause, main clause type of construction. However, you really have to be careful that if you see that in English, if you just saw the English sentence, when Marcus and Sextus throw the ball, the mother will call them. You have to be really careful not to translate that as if it was in the present tense. You have to be mindful that with the future verb in the main clause, the subordinate clause has to be future perfect. Now that we've had that little discussion, let's get into the future perfect endings. The future perfect endings, like I said, do they look familiar? They do look familiar because they are the future forms of sum esse, with the one exception. It's errant, not errant in the third person plural, because we have already used errant in the third person plural for the perfect tense. So just running through these endings real quick, we got ero for first person singular, eris for second person singular, erit for third person singular, erimus for first plural, eritus for third plural, and erint for third plural. As I have said countless times, you take your third principal part, you subtract your long I to clear all the endings, and then from there, you add your ero endings depending on the number and the person for that sentence. Now let's get into the future perfect sentences. When I first knew that I was going to make this video, I knew that I had to include this sentence. This is a line, or two lines actually, from Catullus 13, lines 6 and 7. The English reads, I say, if you will have brought these things, my charming fellow, you will dine well. The Latin for this, which I will read as prose, is Haec si inquam atuleris venuste noster canabis bene. The future perfect verb here is atuleris. This comes from afero. If you don't know about fero fere tulilatus, don't worry about that. Fero is an irregular verb, and it's a little bit wackadoodle, so that's a whole nother video. Don't have to worry about that right now. But afero's third principal part is atuli. Atuli, you subtract the long I, that just leaves you with atul, and then atul plus the second person singular ending, since you is the subject of the sentence, if you will have brought. So you have to add that ending, which is eris. So atul plus eris gives you atul eris. The big thing that I wanted you to take away from this sentence is that as long as you know the third principal part of the verb, you can form whatever you want in the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect. All you got to do, subtract that long I and add the ending based on the tense number and person. A lot of times, I think of Latin as just glorified math class. You just add certain endings based off of where they are. You have to, in this case, subtract certain endings to add other things, and then it equals your sentence. Another way that I think of it is Latin's just like baking a cake, where the words themselves are the ingredients, the endings are the instructions that tell you how everything works together, and your final result, your cake, is your translated sentence. Admittedly, I would rather bake the cake much more than I would like to than translate a sentence, but I think that the two are analogous. If you're having trouble finding the joy in Latin, because believe me, I struggled with this for the first semester I took Latin. Don't think of it as this dead language that your parents forced you to take. Think of it as this code that you're trying to break. Think of this as a problem-solving activity. Don't think of it as a language. Think of it as something that you are trying to solve. And I think that that makes it more rewarding, and I think that it makes Latin more fun. Because Latin, quite honestly, it is a lot of fun, and then it's even better when you can see today what Latins have influenced, like most of our language. You can just drop these big quote unquote SAT words. You can see their architecture in today's society. It's just Latin is such a good language to take, and it's a shame that it doesn't have a better rap because right now it's just thought as of this dead language. But think of it as this problem-solving exercise. And this problem-solving exercise is easier than most because you have a lot of the knowledge already inside you because some of the Latin words already look like some of the English words. Whatever you can do to find the joy in Latin, I think that you should do that because that's what I did, and now I enjoy this so much more than so much more than how I did when I first went into it. Stop thinking of it as a chore and think of it rather as a task that needs to be solved, and you hold the keys of needing to solve it. Now I'm starting to feel like a real teacher. Now your neighborhood Latin teacher, not your neighborhood Latin student, going on rants and getting off topic and all that. But anyways, I got a video to finish here, so let's move on to our next sentence, which unfortunately is not from Catullus or any of the other authors. I just made it up one day, unfortunately. The sentence is, if the slaves will have worked diligently in the fields, the master will praise them. So we translate into Latin as si servi in agris diligenter laboraverent, dominus eius laudabit. The future perfect verb is laboraverent. This comes from laboro. This is a first conjugation verb. Its third principal part is laboravi. Laboravi, subtract that long I, just leaves you with laborav. Laborav plus the third person future perfect ending, which is errant, not errant. That's perfect. Errant is future perfect. So laborav plus errant gets you laboraverent. Now let us practice what I have just been ranting on about really for the last however long this video is. Let us do some practice problemos. So these are once again our forms question, my favorite type of Kurtaman question, and I think that this gives you good practice with endings and really doing that. Subtract the long I and add the correct thing. When you get to the sentences, you'll see how it works really in the whole scheme of things. So for the first sentence, or not for the first sentence, for the first question, if you forget how these work, I'm going to walk through the first one, and then the other three you can do on your own. For the verb scribo, scribere, scripsi, give the second person plural, perfect active indicative form, and its English translation. Yes, I know I'm giving you the third principal part and it's super easy, but odds are you don't have the third principal parts memorized. So I'm more concerned about you getting the practice adding the correct endings than I am about you knowing what those third principal parts are. Because in time, you will memorize them. Believe me, they're very easy to memorize. So we want to take scripsi because we're working in the perfect system. Then we want the second person plural off of that. So subtract the long I, so we're left with scrips, and now they want the second person plural ending for the future, or for the perfect tense, which is istis. So scrips istis gives you scripsistis. They also want the English translation. Scribo means to write. Perfect translations are verbed, this case have verbed or did verb. So your English translation here would be y'all wrote, y'all have written, or y'all did write. Any of those are acceptable answers. So now what I want you to do is take these other three on your own, pause the video, and fill out the correct forms, and give the English translation for them. All right, let's move on to these other three forms questions. Let's start with this first one. For the verb amo, amare, amawi, give the first person singular pluperfect active indicative form and its English translation. So we know that the third principal part is amawi. So let's just right off the bat drop that long I, leave you with amav, and then from there we can add the ending once we determine what that ending is going to be. First person so first we're working in the pluperfect tense, which means we're going imperfect sum esse. So eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant. First person singular for us, luckily, right at the top is eram. So amav plus eram gives you amaweram as your form. Your English translation, amo means to love. Pluperfect is had verbed. First person singular is I, so I had verbed. I had loved. Amaweram, I had loved, would be your answer here. Now we get into the next sentence. For the verb habeo, habere, habui, give the third person plural future perfect active indicative form and its English translation. So, like I said, first thing that I want to do, go to the third principal part, habui, get rid of that long I, just leaves you with habu, and now let's get into the forms, because we know that we're going to have to get rid of that anyway. So now let's look at the rest of the sentence. Third person plural, future perfect. So future perfect, that's what we want to think. So we want to think eroris, erit, erimus, eritus, and then remember, for the third person plural, that goes erint, not erunt. Fortunately for us, it's the third person plural, because sometimes this is just a little teaching thing. Ask yourself the question, why are they asking me about this? Sometimes they'll intentionally manipulate the question so you get the awkward form, which I totally didn't do here. But anyways, so you want future perfects, your future perfect forms, you want your third person plural future perfect, which is erint. Then you add that to your third principal part, sans the long I. So habu plus erint gets you habuerint. And then you want the English translation. For future perfect, for right now, just stick to the will have verbed translation. Habeo means to hold or have, so it would be either, since it's third person plural, they will have had or they will have held. So your complete answer here would be habuerent, they will have had or they will have held. Finally, for the verb wenio, wenire, weni, give the third person plural perfect active indicative form and its English translation. So once again, let's identify our third principal part, weni. Weni, we want to chop off that long I, just leaves you with wane. As we see from the back half of the form indicator, we're working with the perfect system, so we want our e isti it, imus istis errant endings. Now we just got to pick the correct one based on the number and person. This one is third person plural, so once again, e isti it, imus istis errant. We want errant as our third person plural. So wane plus errant gives you wanerant. Wenio means to come, so the translation here that I can use is either came, since it's third person plural, have came, or did come. So third person plural, it would be they. So the final translation, or the final answer would be wanerunt, they came, or they have come, or they did come. All of those would be acceptable translations of wanerunt. All right, let's get into these example sentences. Take a second, pause the video, try and work these out on your own. All right, let's knock through these example sentences. Let's start with the first one. Sextus in Wilam intraverat. If we remember from my discussion of the patterns that the conjugations follow, that AV is indicative of a perfect stem of a third principal part for a first conjugation verb. So you see that and think to yourself, hey, we might be working in the perfect system here. And then after that perfect stem, which I have etched out, which is something that you should do, is etch out that perfect stem when you see it, so you can take a look at the ending, so you get your person number and tense down. But anyways, you look at that ending and it's like, hey, that's a pluperfect ending. So I have a perfect stem plus a pluperfect ending. So yeah, I'm going to be working with the pluperfect here. So that's similar to what your thought process should be. So we know that we're working with the pluperfect. We're going to translate this into English. So we know that the translation is going to be had verbed. The verb here is intro, intrare, it's first conjugation, meaning to enter. Had entered would be the translation for this verb. Now that we have the verb figured out, we can deal with the rest of this sentence. The sentence Sextus in Wilam intraverat could be translated into English as Sextus had entered into the country house. Here's the next sentence. The master will reprimand the slave if he will have fled from the country house. Another way that you could say this in English, and it would be correct, is the master will reprimand the slave if he flees from the country house. Something that's really, really important, and I touched on this earlier, since he flees would be an acceptable translation here, you got to make sure that this does indeed go into the future perfect tense, as opposed to it being accidentally translated into the present tense. If you see future plus something in the or something that looks like it's in the present tense, translate it future perfectly, and that's the only time that you do that. That's why I think that the will have verb translation for right now is a really good idea, so you don't accidentally mess up and you accidentally put something into the present that shouldn't go into the present. So there are two verbs in this sentence. Will reprimand, which is a future tense verb, and then there's will have fled, which is a future perfect verb. We went over future tense verbs in my last video, so I'm not going to dive into that any further, but I will dive into the will have fled. Will have fled, to flee, that verb is fugio. Fugio, fugere, fugi is the third principal part with that long U, G, long I. So now that we have that, let's just get rid of that long I, so we're left with fug. The subject of the sentence is he, if he will have fled. So, since it's he, we know we're working with the third person singular. So the third person singular ending in the future perfect is eret. So we have fug, which is our third principal part, subtracted that long I, plus eret gets you fugeret. And that's the form of the verb that we want to use for that part of the sentence. This entire sentence would be translated into Latin as Dominus servum reprehendet si a villa fugeret. There should be macrons on both the A, or on the A after that long I and C, and there should be a macron on the A in villa. But those macra are important, so you do need to have those. I'll make a note in the description that those were omitted. That should not have been omitted. So now let's take a look at this final sentence. Marcus et Sextus in horto pila lucerunt. We see that there is a perfect ending on this verb in erunt. We know that that's the third person perfect, or the third person plural perfect ending. We know that there's no other ending that we've learned so far that has it. so much so that one ending had to change because of this ending. So we know that we're going to be working in the perfect tense. So however this verb is translated, it's going to be translated as verbed. This comes from the verb ludo, ludere, lucy, meaning to play. So the translation for this one is played. Now that we have the verb out of the way, get to the rest of the sentence. Marcus and Sextus played in the garden with a ball. Now let's move on to this second page of sentences. Take a second, pause the video, and try and work out these on your own. Alright, let's try and take a look at this first sentence. We walked into the fields where the slaves worked. Here we have two verbs that could possibly be in the perfect tense. We have the first verb, walked, definitely in the perfect tense. Then the second verb, it's a little bit more nuanced, and I'll get into that. But first, let's start with the first one, definitely in the perfect tense. We walked. For this part of the sentence, our subject is in the first person plural. We've established that it's in the perfect tense, so now we have to figure out what ending we are going to tack on to the end of the verb so that it agrees with person and number with the subject of the sentence, and also identifies that we're in the perfect tense. So remember, we're using our "it" ending, so "it" imus would be the ending that we tack on to the perfect stem. And just so we're clear, the perfect stem, that's the third principal part minus the long I. That's what I will refer to it. So the third principal part devoid of any endings or anything like that. So now we're going to add imus to the perfect stem. Next thing we got to do, decide what verb we're going to use. A verb to walk is ambulo. It's a first conjugation verb, which has the third principal part, ambulavi. So get rid of that long I, you're just left with ambulav. Then you add imus to it, which gives you ambulav imus, ambulavimus. That is the first verb that's the first verb in the sentence. The second verb is worked. Here, it's a little bit ambiguous. You can have the verb translation also work for imperfect. So that's why I think that the sentence has a bit of ambiguity to it. So either imperfect or perfect will have worked. So if you use laborabant, perfectly acceptable answer, but I'm going to attack this problem as if it was in the perfect tense. So we know that the translation is verbed, so we're going to be working in the perfect tense. This part of the sentence, since the where introduces a new clause, the subject is the slaves. So the subject for this sentence will be in the third person plural. So we got to go back through and find our third person plural perfect ending, which is it, imus, istis, erunt. So we're going to be adding erunt to our perfect stem. Now we got to find our verb. To work, a verb for that is laboro. It's easy because it's a first conjugation verb, so its third principal part is laboravi. Subtract that long I, you're left with laborav, then add your ending erunt to get laboraverunt. So this entire sentence reads, nos in agros ambulavimus ubi seri laboraverunt. It's a little bit of a mouthful. Once again, I really want to hammer this concept home of having pronouns implied by the ending of the verb. As we know by the verb, by the ending of that verb, there's going to be a first person plural subject to the sentence. So either we or us. We know in Latin that the word for that is nos. So we know that the nos is there, even if it is or if it isn't. That's why it's in parentheses, because it's implied. You don't need to have it. If you have it, great. If you don't have it, don't worry about it. That's a little Kurtamen trick. If you're translating a sentence, just add as many pronouns as you know work, so you can stall for a little bit more time and get the rest of the sentence translated. But anyway, as you see in the next part of the sentence, there is a definite subject. The slaves, that's not a pronoun, so we do have to put that into Latin. So that's why we have a subject there in servi, and notice how that agrees with labora verunt. Now we move into the next sentence. Fabulam narrabis si te rogaverit. Here, once again, we have two verbs, but this time what they're clear, their tenses are very clear. The first one, narrabis, is future. The second one, rogaverit, is future perfect. We should have been able to tell that it is future perfect because we see that perfect stem. We see that AV from a first conjugation, from a verb that looks like it's from the first conjugation. Rogo is indeed first conjugation. Then we see that future perfect ending off of that perfect stem. So we know, yay, we're working with the future perfect. It's going to get translated as will have verbed. I'm not really paying as much attention to narrabis because we should know how to translate future. Now, the big thing with this is that I'm really trying to drive home the concept of imply or adding the pronouns being implied with the endings of the verb. So as you see, fabulam, that is in the accusative case. That means that is the direct object. For right now, there is no way for something to be in the accusative case and for it to be the subject. When you get into indirect discourse, late into Latin 2, maybe even Latin 3, there is such a thing, but do not worry about that right now. Fabulam is the direct object, which means it's the direct object. It cannot be the subject of the sentence. And furthermore, that's exemplified by the fact that narrabis, the s ending or the bis ending, tells us that the subject of the sentence is second person singular. So fabulam, a noun, third person singular, and the ending of the verb, second person singular, they don't agree. So you have to have a you, the pronoun you, to start this sentence. It's the same thing with the second half of the sentence. Te, once again, it's in the accusative case. It's the direct object. And the ending of the verb, erit, indicates something in the third person. So, te cannot be the subject because it does not agree with the noun. This subject-verb agreement, you see it sometimes in English, as I hit on in the last video, but it is really exemplified in Latin. You have to have the subject-verb agreement down. So the first part of the sentence will be, you will tell a fabulam, you will tell the story, or you will tell a story. See if, then te rogaverit, if he will have asked you, or if he asks you. Because remember, we can do that thing with future perfect. But remember, look at the verb, make sure that the thing that you think is the subject and the verb actually agree, because if they don't agree, that means it's impossible for them to be the subject. That's how Latin works. So altogether, this fabulam narrabis si te rogaverit is translated as, you will tell the story if he will have asked you, or you will tell the story if he asks you. Now let's move into this final sentence. I had sent the letter into the city with the messenger. As we see there, the verb in this sentence is very early on. I had sent, we see that that's had verbed. The only thing that can be translated as had verbed is pluperfect. So know that we're going to be working with our aramarasarats, our imperfect sum esse endings. First off, let's figure out what the subject of the sentence is. The subject of the sentence is I, so we're going to have our first singular ending. So we're going to have our third principal part subtracted from that long I, so we just have our perfect stem. Then we're going to have to add the first singular form of sum esse, which is eram. The verb to send is mitto. Its principal parts are mitto, mittere, misi. So drop that long I, you're just left with mis. And then you have to add your ending eram, so mis plus eram gets miseram as your verb for this sentence. So altogether, the sentence is ego. Once again, it's implied, don't have to have it. Epistulam in urbem cum nuntio miseram. That would be how this sentence is translated. In closing, Latin verbs have principal parts, which can be used to create different forms of the verb. The perfect active system works by adding the endings for each tense onto the third principal part, subtract with the long I from the ending of that third principal part subtracted. The perfect active system has three tenses. The perfect tense, which can be translated as verbed, did verb, or has or have verbed, depending on the subject-verb agreement. The pluperfect tense, which is translated as had verbed, and the future perfect tense, which was translated as will have verbed or verbs, considering it is with a future verb in a future verb in a main clause. Normally, you will see the future perfect tense in a subordinate clause with a future tense verb. Here are the different endings that you would tack on to that third principal part. For perfect, you attach a long I to the first person singular, isti, I-S-T-I to the second person singular, it, I-T to the third person, considering it's third person singular. For first person plural subject, you would add the imus ending, I-M-U-S, second person plural, istis, I-S-T-I-S, and third person plural, erunt, E-R-U-N-T. Moving on to the pluperfect tense, the endings for the pluperfect tense are just imperfect sum esse. So, eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant. Considering that you have the present system of sum esse memorized, should be a breeze. The future perfect tense, a little bit more of the same. This is the future forms of sum esse, the future active forms of sum esse, I should say. Ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritus, erint. That is the one exception, except for third person plural, which has erint. Has to be erint because we already have erint in the third person plural for perfect. And lastly, memento, remember. These endings are added to the third principal part minus the long I. This goes for all verbs in all conjugations considering that it's a relatively normal verb. There's no weird rules that you have to follow like you had to in the present system where you really had to rely on the conjugation to conjugate the verb. This is pretty straightforward. It's just tack these endings on to the third principal part minus that long I. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful rest of your day.